Well, our first installment of the year 2013 of a feature we do about every month or 6 weeks here called Ask the Premier. Premier Brad Wall will usually join us from his office. We'll find him en route on the phone, and occasionally we find him in studio, and this is where we join the Premier today. Mr. Premier, thanks for being here.
Good morning, John.
Now, Ask the Premier works this way, my friends. It's your opportunity on the Business of Saskatchewan to put your questions to Premier Brad Wall. You may do it on the phone, 1-877-332-8255. Lines are already lighting up. Get your call in now. Or you can text 306-306. Name and town, please. Also, Twitter, Facebook, any other ways you want to keep in touch with the Premier. Okay, so while we wait for you to get ready, I always come armed with a few questions. Premier, now that you go into 2013, last time you and I talked was a year-ender for 2012. As you look ahead, legislatively, growth of the province, policy side, what are some of the things you're looking for in Saskatchewan this year?
Well, we're going to see continued growth in the province. We're not immune to what's going on worldwide in terms of various economies, in terms of the global economy. But there's signs of life in the U.S. economy. There's signs of at least more stability over in Europe. And then there's increasing talk of, for example, the Chinese economy gaining some strength. Having said all of that, I think you're going to see a balanced approach by the province, by the provincial government, and I think, frankly, by those that create jobs in Saskatchewan. I think you're going to see optimism manifest itself and new jobs created. Conference Board of Canada is forecasting will lead the country in economic growth. I think you're going to see continued strength in the resource sector and in agriculture. And then for our part, we've always talked about growth not being the end game, but rather being a means to the end, which is that virtuous circle, that we would be able to invest in quality of life, that we'd be able to keep taxes competitive so that we can continue to attract people and investment. And so not a lot of surprises in this year. We'll continue to implement the growth plan for the province, and hopefully we'll continue to see the strength of Saskatchewan continue. We're really in a leadership position right now, and obviously it's something we'd like to see continue.
Premier Brad Wall is here. On the question of our resource-based economy, when you're in the commodity business, how variable, how uncertain could that be?
Well, for example, this last year, we saw a real lack of sales in potash. We'll talk potash for a moment in important markets like China and India. Here recently, some pretty positive announcements with a bit of a softer price, but large quantities of sales being announced for Saskatchewan potash in China, and lots of speculation that India will follow. We also saw some strength in markets for potash other than those areas in North America and in South America that's benefited Saskatchewan. It's created jobs here. So there'll always be the volatility. And in the case of oil, the same is true in terms of price. We see it fluctuate on a daily basis, obviously. However, I'd make this point, John, that we may be into a situation now where the floor prices, the bottom end of the things that Saskatchewan produces in prolific quantities, it has changed, and perhaps it's changed for the long term. For example, if $400 per ton of potash, which is the price of these recent sales, is considered to be a low price, well, there
was a time we did 200.
Absolutely, and that would have been an average price. Yeah. Same with oil. So it touches into the mid 80s, and people talk about a real weak price for West Texas. Now it's over $90 again, where a weak price for oil in the past would have been half of that or less. So it's positive for areas of the world that have a lot of these resources, and that's why I think there's some optimism going forward.
Couple of stories, and they are related. The federal court decision yesterday that takes, and it's a very preliminary ruling, but the concept is it takes existing Métis and non-status Indian people and designates them as Indian for the purpose of the federal constitution. Provincially, does that kind of decision have an impact?
Well, it certainly would. We're looking at the decision ourselves in terms of the Ministry of Justice, for example. We heard from the Federal Minister of Aboriginal Affairs yesterday indicating that the federal government wasn't commenting in specific beyond that they're reviewing the decision. I guess they'll now make a decision, the federal government will, on whether they appeal this to the Supreme Court of Canada. And if that happens, we're talking about that's a fairly lengthy process. We're already into it for over a decade right now, and it's going to be even longer if they appeal. But if this decision were to stand either in its current form, with the federal government agreeing, or it stands in the Supreme Court, should an appeal occur, the impact is significant. We have a lot of non-status Indians and a lot of Métis people in our province on a per capita basis as high as you'll find anywhere in the Dominion of Canada. And so if you have a federal government now taking responsibility, jurisdiction, and providing then the resources that jurisdiction implies, that's going to be a significant injection of the federal government and federal resources into the province. That would be the most dramatic effect. I think if you talk to the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan, they would say there's the implications in terms of harvesting rights, in terms of other rights that they would now be entitled to as a result of the decision. But these are all potentially to have impact on the province, notwithstanding the federal government decision on appeal.
Premier Bradwell, other related issue, the Idle No More campaign, which started back in December now, roughly just over a month ago. There are flash mobs, there are demonstrations going on around the country, and of course the genesis is the 4 women in Saskatchewan who started this. What is your take on the impact of Idle No More on Aboriginal relations in Saskatchewan?
When I first saw this hashtag, and I think that's where I saw the words "Idle No More" for the first time, is on Twitter, and obviously this was very early on, and there's been a lot of coverage since. It's dominated the news. When I first saw the hashtag, this movement, the title for the movement, I was hopeful because, John, we released our growth plan for the province in the fall, and you might remember that featuring quite prominently in that growth plan is the need for us to a greater extent engage First Nations, engage Aboriginal people in the economy. We've got a labor shortage. There's 9,400 jobs on saskjobs.ca this morning as I drove into Saskatoon and looked at the website. We know we're going to need 60,000 jobs moving forward to 2020. That's highlighted in the growth plan. So yes, we need to attract new Canadians to this province. We need to attract expatriates back to Saskatchewan. We also need, frankly, and this should be the priority, we need First Nations to be involved, engaged in the economy to a greater extent than they are. So, I'm hopeful that those involved in support of Idle No More understand the opportunity that's here, not just in terms of jobs, but our determination as a government to offer training, post-secondary training, secondary training, adult basic education. We want to eliminate the wait list for that because I just hope that Idle No More in this province manifests itself as a real movement towards getting involved in the economy and taking part in the opportunity that's here. And on our part, for the government's part, that we are continued to be focused in providing educational opportunities like we have an increased support for the Saskatchewan Indian Institute of Technology or Gabriel Dumont. We need to be doing our part, but I'm hoping that's what it means in the long term for this province.
Premier Brad Wallace here. This is Ask the Premier, our first edition, 2013. Okay, I look at the board. We have calls coming up on care workers, so-called frontline workers in non-governmental organizations. We have the whole issue of highways, building more bridges versus ferries, the status of crown corporations in the province, among others, and we'll get back to text, tweets, and more. This is Ask the Premier. Next, your questions. To Premier Brad Wall, I'm John Gormley, and this is News Talk Radio. I'm John Gormley. This is our first edition 2013 Ask the Premier. Premier Brad Wall is here. We go mainly to your calls on the phone, 1-877-332-8255. But if you do have a query on Twitter, Facebook, texting at 306-306, we will get to those as well. All right, let's go to Rick in Martinsville, who is the first caller hanging on. Rick, you're on with the Premier, and it's about highways and infrastructure.
Yeah, I was just wondering if there's any plans or if there could be a point to possibly look at the ferries and maybe bridging them instead of the ferries. Like the ferries are really good. It's specifically Clarkville Ferry. I know it's a high-traffic ferry, but there's a good 3-month period where the ferries close down and the ice isn't thick enough to cross there. But I know that gets a lot of traffic from north of Saskatoon over to Aberdeen for people trying to get across to the east and over to the west.
So I guess
interesting question. Thanks, Rick, for the call. Well, when it comes to bridges, there is a more than a latent demand for more investment in bridges. Certainly in this city, City Council is talking about a North Bridge and the need for that, and the City of Prince Albert as well. We have as well the case being made for a very, very large bypass, Regina area bypass project that we're wanting to see if that's feasible, certainly in the short and the midterm. So given the demands, I'm not sure we could move aggressively converting ferries to bridges. Everything's driven significantly by traffic counts, as you know, whether it's a new bridge or highway twinning or passing lanes, and I'm not sure the case can be made there. That would be the fairly direct answer to Rick's question there. There's bridges that are needed. I'm not sure, though, that ferries to bridges would be close to the top of the list.
This is Ask the Premier, 1-877-332-8255. Brian in Saskatoon, you're on with Premier Brad Wall.
Good morning, John, and morning, Mr. Premier. My question is about, we're hearing a lot of talk about the crowns again, more specifically selling SGI or selling SaskTel. What's going on with that? If you could please answer those for me.
Sure. Well, thanks, Brian. What's going on with that is a newspaper column is what's going on with that. And, I did some year-end interviews where I was asked a question about whether or not the province is ready to have a debate about the future of Crown corporations. In the long term, some have cast some concern or worry about the future of SaskTel, for example, as a relatively small government-owned Crown in a very competitive environment with large companies. The same has been said for the general insurance side of SGI, and I think that's the source for some of the commentary we've seen specific to these crowns. But let me be very crystal clear. We campaigned in the last election. I think it's page 43 of our platform, if I remember that correctly, where we say, Brian, that we will not be amending, that we will not be changing the crowns that are protected by something called the Saskatchewan Crown Corporation Protection Act, which basically rules out the privatization of these organizations. If there's going to be some change in that from any political party, it would have to come in the context of an election campaign, and people will be able to either vote it up or vote it down. But that's probably the source for some of the commentary. Our position hasn't changed. We campaigned on promises with respect to the crowns. We intend to keep them. But
you've got issues like, and I want to get you into this anyway, maybe this is the time, summary accounting versus general revenue fund accounting. So, let's go to a full summary accounting. Every single dollar the government spends shows up, whether it's in a Crown corporation, whatever. So a Crown takes on debt. Government debt goes up. So the power corporation goes and borrows money. The phone company does. Most places that have publicly traded utility companies, a TELUS, a Bell, who provide their phone service, it doesn't show up on the government's books. So are you hamstrung in part by the fact we have more government ownership in this province than other places? So when government corporations borrow money, it does affect on a summary accounting basis the overall provincial debt.
I don't think we're hamstrung at all, John, but it is why we report on both general revenue fund basis and what you're referring to, the summary financial statement basis. And the auditor has said you should report on summary financials. Well, we do. We absolutely report the complete picture of government. And you're right. When we do that, all of the debts in the Crown corporations come to bear, and you can see on those overall statements. But we also report what I would call the operating account for the government of Saskatchewan, for the people of Saskatchewan. That's the general revenue fund. And that's, of course, been in a balance. And by the way, so is the summary financial statements in a balanced budget position. But people can then see both. They can see what are the operating account, much like their checking account would be perhaps for their own household or a business, their operating account, and then they can see the overall picture when you consider all the operating revenues and expenses of the crowns, their debts. But we're in a good spot financially right now for the province, and how we report things shouldn't inform, I don't think, what we're going to do with Crown corporations now or in the future. But
should we be carrying that kind of debt? I mean, do the people of Saskatchewan need more debt? Because years ago, when Alberta government telephones was sold off, when BC Tel was moved on, we just decided to hang on to a government-owned phone company. I mean, is that a practical use of public debt?
Well, there's also a huge amount of equity on the books because of those Crown corporations. SaskTel brings along with it significant revenue. It'll make revenue this year. It'll pay a dividend back to the people of the province, and it has a lot of equity to contribute to the financial statement as well. So I'm not sure that should. Again, I'll just repeat. I don't think that should inform the discussion that we may want to have one day in this province about what do we do to ensure that SaskTel lasts for the long term as a Saskatchewan headquartered company, or the same for SGI General Insurance. I'm not sure that how we account for the provincial finances is a big part of that debate. It's a part of it. I'm not sure it's a big part.
Premier Brad Wall, let's get back to the calls. 1-877-332-8255. Ken in Saskatoon, you're on with the Premier on so-called frontline workers in non-government organizations.
Yeah, Mr. Premier, a few weeks ago you announced that organizations that support services for vulnerable and adults and children were going to be getting a lot more money in order to increase wages for frontline staff. I was wondering if you could talk about that.
Ken, this is a huge issue in the province. We were hearing, even prior to the election, we'd hear from community-based organizations, especially those involved with providing opportunity and care for those with intellectual and physical disabilities. We were hearing from them how hard it is for them to keep staff, because they would train staff up. These are people, very special people who have a great deal of passion to be working in this area. But sometimes it's hard not to overlook the fact that there's a wage discrepancy sometimes between health regions in these CBOs, sometimes in sectors that aren't even related to the area where wages have gone up. Our average weekly earnings in this province are up over 20% in the last 4 years as a result of a growing economy. And so we had calls from CBOs who were saying, we need to keep these people. We need to retain them. We need to recruit more. We have a shortage. And it's an expensive commitment we made, but on 17 December, just before Christmas, we announced $17 million additional dollars immediately to move into the sector so that these CBOs can keep the people who are working with those who have intellectual and physical disabilities. There'll be longer-term costs, but we have to meet them. We have a goal, John, as you know, in this province. We outlined it in the growth plan, and that goal is that this province would be the best place in Canada for families of those with disabilities and obviously for those who have disabilities. And we're not there yet, but this is another step down that road.
And how does $17 million work its way through the system?
Well, we're going to be very careful on that. It's the right question because we want to make sure it gets to those frontline staff. And by the way, we don't have a lot of worry in this regard because the CBOs know that in order to stay operating at a high level and provide the care they want and the opportunity they want, they need the people. And so their commitment is to direct these funds to the staff. And it's hard to say, look, it means this much per hour because the wages vary and the kinds of work that's involved varies. But we know the CBOs are absolutely determined and diligent, and will be very diligent about making sure the $17 million gets to where it's supposed to be.
Premier Brad Wallace here. This is Ask the Premier, our first session of the new year. When we come back, some questions on health care, also questions on natural resources and fisheries, and we're going to ask the Premier about concerns raised by the opposition on what they say are increased numbers of power outages and concerns they have about Sask Power. We'll put that question here next. I'm John Gormley, 1-877-332-8255. This is News Talk Radio. I'm John Gormley. This is Ask the Premier, our very first session of the year 2013. When Premier Brad Wall is here, of course, we go to the phones at 1-877-332-8255. We also, of course, get your feedback, whether it's texting 306-306, whether Twitter, or any other way you want to keep in touch. And emails, johngormleylive@rawlco.com. Okay, as we get back to the calls, one question, Premier, I had just mentioned as we headed into the bottom of the hour. The NDP opposition, Trent Wotherspoon, the critic for Sask Power, says there are too many unreliable power outages by the Crown-owned Sask Power. He is calling on the government and Sask Power to ensure that something is done about this. How do you respond?
Well, first of all, there's a lot of work being done on this particular issue and has been over the last number of years. In fact, last year, I should say, John, that over the last 5 years, since our government took office, we have increased the amount of power line maintenance spending in Sask Power by 57% over Mr. Weatherspoon's party when it was in power. I also want to point out that we inherited a situation at Sask Power where there is a huge infrastructure deficit. The reason is because the NDP and government took huge dividends from Sask Power. We've adopted a policy of late to not take any dividends.
But you did take some.
We've taken some. We took a special dividend when there was a lot more money made by Sask Power because of all the water we had in the province, and hydroelectricity was used to a greater extent. And so Sask Power made a lot more money, and we had damages from the same flooding in the same water. And so we used some of that money to apply to the damages that we were recovering through the Provincial Disaster Assistance Program. But the numbers are pretty clear. 2002 to 2006 under the NDP, $456 million were taken in dividends from this corporation when it ought to have been reinvesting in power maintenance and stations and that sort of thing. 2007 to 2011, other than this $120 million special dividend, we're at just over $100 million over that whole period of time in regular dividends taken by our government. Why? Because we're reinvesting in power maintenance. That expenditure's up 57%. With respect to Southeast Saskatchewan, where a lot of the issues are in terms of the brownouts, and I think that might be what Mr. Weatherspoon's referring to, voltage monitoring equipment is being installed in the Torquay area to address the power quality issues, and what's called a new low voltage feeder line is being built at Hallbright. We expect it to be working, energized, up and running by the first quarter of 2013. So this isn't acceptable in winter. You don't want brownouts or blackouts, obviously. We're making these investments, and Mr. Weatherspoon should check the history of his party's treatment of Sask Power, perhaps before he makes comment. But it's for the constituents and the people in that area that are facing these brownouts, it's a valid concern, and we're moving on it. We're making the investments that need to be made.
Premier Brad Walls here. It's Ask the Premier, first edition of 2013. Let's go to Sabrina in Saskatoon. Sabrina, you have a health care question on cleft palate coverage.
Yes, good morning. I have a question regarding a NAM appliance. It's an appliance that is used with children with cleft lip and palate. What it does is it brings the gap closer together at the top of their gums. And our province pays $357 for one. They will pay up to 5, though, according to the fee guide. But if they're done properly, they only need 1. And unfortunately, my son and I had to move to Calgary to get a professional. Our dentist in the province here didn't take the training.
And how much does one cost?
Minimum $3,800.
Okay, so the province will pay a portion of that $3,800.
Yeah, they'll pay $357, but they'll pay up to 5.
So you're saying up to 5 appliances over time, but the maximum amount is $357. Is that right, Sabrina?
Yes.
Okay.
And the children only need 1. And what it does is it eliminates bone grafting to the best of its ability. My son went from having to have 2 lip surgeries and bone grafting to having neither. So for us having to leave the province, it's not covered here. Mm-hmm. But in most other provinces, it is. Now, for us doing this appliance, we have not only saved the government 1 lip surgery, but we've also saved them the money of having to do bone grafting.
Okay, so Sabrina, you're wondering why in Saskatchewan it isn't covered when you believe it should be.
Yeah, because we're saving you money by taking this money out of our pockets.
Sabrina, thanks very much for the call and for the information. I'm going to check into this, especially with respect to this the current policy where we'll provide coverage for a small amount of coverage for up to 5 different appliances, and to find out perhaps through the health ministry if that's being reviewed to see if that can be focused more on 1 or 2, and then the amounts can be more helpful to families. I'm obviously we want to make sure we're taking our cues here from healthcare professionals, but I'd like to check into it and report back if I can.
So next session we'll have an answer back?
Sure.
Premier Brad Walls here. Let's go back to the calls. 1-877-332-8255. John in Saskatoon, a highways question for you.
Yes, good morning, Premier Walls.
Good morning.
I have a question on the Yellowhead Highway between Saskatoon and Yorkton. why we can't have passing lanes put in. Because of the amount of semis, and in summertime you'll have farm vehicles, which are huge now, and you'll get lineups of 2 or 3 miles sometimes of vehicles trying to pass.
John, it's a great question. We're going to see continued traffic in that area as a result of related resource developments, something that we welcome, but it causes traffic pressures. And then we just have growing populations in that area as well. And in the two communities that you're talking about, that the Yellowhead attaches in this respect are obviously growing. And that is why we've announced what will be an increased use of passing lanes in the province, an increased number of passing lanes constructed. I don't know about what's planned specifically on 16. We can check into that certainly, but you should be expecting here in this next year and in the years ahead, John, that you'll see the government moving more aggressively in the use of passing lanes. This particular highway is a candidate for that, as is number 7 between Saskatoon and Rosetown, which is obviously increasing in traffic as well.
So now you announced that budget last, but in terms of the implementation in the Highways Department, I mean, how long does it take to get these things done?
Well, I think there's work already being done, and again, I can check into the details of it, but we'd want to see action sooner rather than later. The traffic issues are now, and they're current, and they're significant.
Premier Brad Wall, a question on texting 306-306 from Catlin. What is the future of community pastures in Saskatchewan after the federal decisions?
So the federal government has decided to get out of the community pastures, as you know, and basically left it to the province. And so that's an important point to make. As people are concerned about the issue, their first step should perhaps be to express concern to their members of Parliament. Having said that, we are prepared to work with patrons of these pastures who have in many cases been patrons of them for some period of time. We've currently said we'll look at selling these pastures to those patrons who are obviously very responsible as users and would be as landowners, and some of the most ecologically responsible landowners you'd find in the country are Saskatchewan farmers and Saskatchewan ranchers, because it's how they make their living. The other option is to continue to leasing them. We've heard concerns voiced against selling them to anybody. Obviously, we'd be focused on patrons, but there's a concern from groups and from some of the patrons as well that we remove that as an option. I think the minister's heard some of those concerns. There's not a change in policy with respect to what we've said already, lease or buy, but we're always meeting with and listening to groups who have concerns in the area.
Is there a shifting downward of cost? I mean, if Ottawa gets away and the province administers them in exactly the same way they were, does title change to the province, but other costs run with it? How does that work?
We want to mitigate that risk. I think as we move forward with this plan, we've done so in a way that we don't want there to be an additional cost to Saskatchewan taxpayers. In other words, that these things run as close to cost recovery as possible. That may not be possible in every single circumstance, but that's the effort that's going to be made. And that's why one of the options to sell these pastures to the patrons, not to companies. I've seen that mused about in social media and other places that, we're going to need this land will be sold to corporations or sold to some other interests. We're talking about the people currently using the pastures as being potential purchasers of them if they choose, and that's just one of the options. The other one is to continue to lease them.
Premier Brad Wallace here. This is Ask the Premier. Stand by. More calls, more questions as well on the business of your Saskatchewan. I'm John Gormley, and this is News Talk Radio. I'm John Gormley, Premier Brad Wallace here. This is our regular monthly, every 6 weeks or so session of what we call Ask the Premier, and this is our first go of the year 2013. 1-877-332-8255. Many ways you can get in to ask the Premier some questions. Let's, in fact, check out the status. I was just doing texts, and we had the question on community pastures. That came from one of our texters. So let's go back to the phones now and check in on a healthcare question in Swift Current. Scott, you're on with Premier Brad Wall.
Yes. Hi, Premier Wall. I was wondering if there's any plans to cover insulin pump equipment and accessories after the age of 18 for residents of Saskatchewan with diabetes.
Thanks very much for the call, Scott. As you know, in the last election campaign, we made a commitment to expand the coverage to up to the age of 18, and I remember that day on the campaign trail. It was welcomed by by those in the diabetes community, the sector, of course, that advocates on behalf of those who have diabetes. And in our province, we have a very high incidence of this. And so we're always looking at the potential to expand the coverage even beyond it. As you know, we've already kept that promise that we made in the election campaign for that initial expansion. We're looking for opportunities to expand it. And we're also always working hard to make sure the budget is fiscally responsible. One of the advantages right now of our province is that we have a balanced budget, both on the summary side and the general revenue side, as we were talking earlier. And that's unique in the country today. And I think it underpins the strength of our growth plan and our economy, and an advantage we want to keep. However, the reason we want that economic strength is so that we can make investments in quality of life, like expanding coverage for insulin pumps, expanding the groups that are eligible, the age groups that are eligible. And so it's something we're looking at. I can't tell you that there's immediate plans for an expansion in the age group. That wouldn't be fair, because it's not true in terms of the budget upcoming. But we're always looking at the issue and hearing from the caller, for example, and those who advocate on behalf of people with diabetes.
Premier Brad Wall, when you talk about upcoming budget, in particular, the last budget, the end of the film tax credit, which had a big political push by the small group in the film industry, but many others who believed this wasn't a good policy move, is there something being done in the visual entertainment area that you're looking at for the next budget or the future?
Well, the short answer is yes. We're not going to be going back to the tax credit, which wasn't really a tax credit. It was a grant paid to up to 40% of labor costs for a project. And often what would happen is a company would come in and set up a numbered company or a shell to access the credit, some of them from outside the province, not all of them. And there was a benefit to the industry here, but it was a grant. And we were involved in a bidding war, and industry was saying if we're going to stay in this game, we have to actually increase the amount of taxpayers' money, the amount of grant we're prepared to put into the sector, because other jurisdictions were doing that. We just said we're not going to be in the bidding war anymore. Now, since then, the minister responsible has been meeting with the creative industries, not just film, but music as well, and the rest of the creative industries in the province, to see what we can replace the tax credit with, so that there is support not just for film, but perhaps also for music, which has not had, some would say, the degree of support that film and other sectors have had, and yet music is obviously crucial and a very important sector here in the province. So I think you'll see a more universal approach. We'll try to look at all the creative industries. We've heard from them. I think the minister will be reporting soon and will want to provide support there. We've increased funding to the arts overall. Our government has by over 30% in our first term. Our commitment's there. We just don't think that this tax credit / grant was the best policy, the best use of taxpayers' resources, and we're looking at a broader approach. You'll be hearing about that in the months ahead.
All right, let's go to one call back quickly. Cherney in Regina, back to transportation infrastructure. You have a question for the Premier.
Yes, sir. Good morning, gentlemen. My question is there a plan in the works to make a bypass the city from like Pilot Butte to Pinky Road, so the big trucks don't have to go through the city and jam up Vic East in the morning there and all that stuff?
The answer is yes. It's a very expensive plan. If you take a look at the complete bypass opportunity that we know exists for the city of Regina, we're looking at hundreds of millions of dollars.
Okay, we're some of the laryngitis twins today.
That's right. Well, when you're trying to balance the budget, you talk about hundreds of millions of dollars, you lose your voice, things happen. But we know the project is very crucial, not just for the city of Regina, but for the global transportation hub, which is increasingly an economic engine in the province, and for just generally the economy in Regina and area for our capital, but for the surrounding area as well. So that's why, by the way, we've established Sask Builds. In our growth plan, we outlined a brand new approach, a new Treasury Board Crown Corporation that's going to look at alternative measures of financing, private-public partnerships, in different and innovative approaches to financing large projects like this one, so that we don't have to wait years and years and maybe over a decade before we get something that's needed fairly quickly done in the province. So I think we're going to make continued progress on that particular bypass, and we look forward to announcements down the road, but we won't be doing it the same way we've always done it. We have large infrastructure demands in the province, and it's part of our growth plan to meet those infrastructure demands so that growth doesn't start piling into itself. We don't want growth itself to actually become a barrier to continued and sustained growth in the future, and that means we need to invest in infrastructure. We need to do it in an innovative way because the demands are great.
Premier Brad Wall, but much the same question on the Saskatoon front. Saskatoon's now talking about a commuter bridge in addition to a perimeter highway. So you've got the two big cities, both with huge growth imperatives.
And we have in other centers that aren't quite as large as Regina and Saskatoon, we have also some important infrastructure demands as well. So these very much have the attention of government. It is why we have set up Sask Builds. It's why we're continuing to talk to the municipal sector and the federal government about what we think will be the next iteration of a federal, provincial, local infrastructure program like the Canada Builds program was, and it remains a high priority.
Premier, thank you, and we'll see you next month on Ask the Premier.
Thanks, John.
Premier Brad Wall. I'm John Gormley. This is News Talk Radio.